of my wife's grandmother, Esther bas Mordechai, a lady from Frankfurt who managed to get out on one of the last trains and rebuild her life in America. Amen. Okay. Okay, so again, I'll thank by starting the Shul Kilat Chaverim for hosting the Shir, a wonderful place to daven and learn here in Yerushalayim. Okay, there's so many things in these Parshas that we have to try to focus on a very small sliver and to get a taste of the treasure house that's hiding behind that sliver. So before we get to the question the Shem Shmuel asks on one particular point, it's going to be about Lot. And it is surprising to us that there is so much in these Parshas about this character of Lot. And Lot is very confusing. On one hand, Lot is the father of the line of Mashiach. There's a pasuk in Tehillim that says, Matzasi David Avdi, I found my servant David. The Medrash says, Heichan Matzasi, where did I find David? Bisdom, I found David in Sdom. Because Lot went to Sdom, and inside Lot was David HaMelech, because Rus came from Moab, and Moab was a grandchild of Lot, so it was there. He was there. On the other hand, those two nations that did come out of Lot, Moab and Ammon, are viewed as so negative that the males of those nations can never marry into the Jewish people. So he has this interesting combination. On one hand, we find that he's separated off from Avram Avinu. We find that Avram Avinu went to save him, right? And here we find also that again, he went to Sdom, became a leader among them, and yet he's saved. So let's try to focus on one thing. I will mention, just someone asked, last week we spoke about the fact that all the Imahos came from Haran, right, who gave up his life because he believed in what Avram Avinu stood for, even though he was not able to merit the miraculous escape that Avram Avinu had. And we have to realize also that Lot and the line of Mashiach also came from Haran. And I saw Rabbi Moshe Shapira in the print-ups of his shurim that they bring out, he said, you got to realize that all of it, the whole shooting match, came from Terach. Right? In other words, all the Avos and all the Himos came from Terach. There were other branches in the world, okay? Terach was one branch from the descendants of Shem, and it's interesting that they all came from him. Now, what Terach was doing, and we find this just before Parshas Lech Lecha, at the end of Noach, and I can't remember how many times I'd read it till I saw something that took my attention to it, that Terach was traveling to Canaan, right? It says that Vayikach Terach es Avram beno, ves Lot ben Haran ben beno, ves Sarai kaloso eshes Avram beno, vayetzu itom me'or kastim laleches arzo Canaan, vayavo ad Haran vayeshu sham. Terach, before Avram Avinu was told Lech Lecha, was traveling with his family to Canaan. He didn't get there. He stopped in Haran. Why was he traveling to Canaan? So the Sforno said that it was known even then that a person who was seeking truth, seeking understanding, that Eretz Yisrael was the place that a person could get that. Terach was a seeker. And Terach ended up stopping too early in that place where the Medrash says he served Avodah Zarah. He recognized that Hashem set up powers in the world, and he decided we should interact with those powers. We're not interacting with whoever created those powers. Avram Avinu was the one who took that further. But Rav Moshe said it could very well be that as a result of Terach's initial starting of that journey, so he merited to have all of that come from him. Okay, so now we want to take a look at part of this puzzling story of Lot and Sodom. We have the Malachim, okay, and here the Torah very much, it doesn't just say people, like with Avram Avinu. Avram Avinu was looking out at the tent in the beginning of the parasha. He saw Shlosha Anoshim, 3 people, and Rashi explains to us that those were Malachim. Here it says straight out in the pasuk, Vayavo Shnei Malachim Sdoma Ba'erev. These 2 Malachim came to Sdom, and Lot takes them into his house, even though it was against the law in Sdom to have guests. Okay, they did not want to share the wealth. They had tremendous wealth. Right? It says in the pasuk before, when Lot decided he wanted to go to Sodom, he said it says it was kulo mashke, kigana Shem ke'eretz Mitzrayim bo achat tzoar. So I don't know, I didn't get to check up for sure if this is true, but in Mitzrayim, I saw this little documentary about what's called the Nile Delta. The Nile Delta has this fascinating property. It got messed up a little bit when they built the big dam at Aswan to stop the flooding. It was incredibly fertile, and it produced crops constantly with no breaks, 365 days a year. It had the combination of temperature, tremendous amount of water, and the silt at that point in the Nile that came was full of nutrients. So the land never got tired, never got thirsty, and kept going. From what the Midrashim say, that what Sodom and Amorah were like before the destruction, it was like that. Tremendous wealth, tremendous fertility, and they wanted to keep it all for themselves. Now, they are surrounding the house, asking to do bad things to these malachim, and they eventually pull Lot into the house, and everyone storms the house. They want to go in. The pasuk says, "Ve'esa anoshim asher pesach habayis hiku basanverim mikaton v'ad gadol vayil'u limtzoa pasach." So the people that were reaching Pesach habayis, the opening of the house, they were struck with sanverim. Now sanverim, Rashi says, is an ivaron, but when you look in many mefarshim, it's a very unique kind of word. It's not blindness that you can't see anything. It's a blindness where you are seeing deceptively multiple images of that which you're seeking, but they're not real. So they kept seeing a doorway and trying to go in and bouncing, the opposite of Harry Potter's thing there at this train station, right? So they were just bouncing off. The Malbim says, why does it say mikaton va'ad gadol, from the youngest to the oldest? Why not just say everybody? He said, because first the young people, the hotheads, were the ones who were first there. And they had the sanverim. Then the older people came to try to solve the problem. And they also got sanverim. That was there at the point. Okay, so that stopped the threat over there. The people of Sodom had this sanverim. And now they tell Lot, milachapo, who else do you have in town? Chasan ubanecha benosecha, a son-in-law, sons, daughters, kol asher lecha ba'ir, whatever you have in this town, hotzei min hamakom. Get them out of here because we're going to destroy it. So Lot goes to speak to his sons-in-law. Okay, now there are different things in the Mefarshim. Why didn't he speak to his daughters? Some say that it was clear to him his daughters would stay with him, but the sons-in-law were going to be a problem. So he spoke to his chatanav lokchei benotav, his sons-in-law who took his daughters. Vayomer, he says, kumutzu min hamakom hazeh, get up and get out of this place, ki mashchis Hashem es ha'ir, because Hashem is going to destroy the city. Vayehi ki mitzachek beinei chasanav, and he was like a joker in the eyes of his sons-in-law. So Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky in his Emes Liakov, he asked the question, he says, why does the Torah even need to tell us this? Right? There seems to be a huge amount of detail. Right? And he says, Yesh levay madua aleinu ladas uvdazu. Why do we need to know this little fact of family relationships here? What is the Torah teaching us with this? That's really going to be our search tonight, to try to understand what was going on with these sons-in-law and how it relates to this particular semi-blindness of sanverim that the people of Sodom got. So we'll start with the Shem Shmuel, right, who asked this question. Vayhi ki mitzachek beinei chatanav. He was viewed as like a joker in the eyes of his sons-in-law. V'yesh li timoah. So the Shem Shmuel, again, always his questions are very practical, very down to earth. He says, you got to wonder about this. Harei hayuroim be'eineihem pele gadol. They saw with their eyes a very miraculous thing. Shekol ha'ir, everyone in the town, minar v'ad zaken, from the youngest to the oldest, huku b'sanverim v'nulu mimtzoa pesach. They had their vision messed with, tampered with, so they could not find a simple door of a house that was right in front of them. That is a miraculous occurrence. They were sitting right there, he said. That should have at least got a little bit of concern in their head that when Lot says, you know those two guys, the ones that everybody tried to get into the door to hurt them and they couldn't? They told me that Hashem says the town is going down now. Let's get out. And they laughed. How? Why would that be? So he explains like this. This, in fact, was a... Please? So Lot was trying to get his sons-in-law to leave. But they laughed at him. Okay, so the Shem Shmuel says this was simply a continuation of this makkah, of this plague, of this type of blindness that's called sanverim. Meaning, just as the people of Sodom weren't able to see the door of that house, the sons-in-law just weren't able to see the imminent danger that was right in front of them and that Lot was telling them. Okay, so he says, despite the fact that they saw that, it simply bounced off. So the Shem Shmuel wants to teach us something about this. He said, Zeh limud la'adam. This should be a lesson to us. Sheish kama zmanim v'kama inyanim. There are many times in life and many happenings in life. Asher bim yosim aleim lev hayoro miploos tomim deim hashgachaso aprotis v'aschar v'onesh. If you would keep your eyes open, you would see Hashem's hashgacha in the world in so many different places. And you would see reward and punishment. But if a person intentionally wants to walk in the darkness, he doesn't want to see that. He doesn't want to deal with this. So you too, we too, can get this makkah of sanverim, which means ro'eh ve'eino ro'eh. He sees all the things, but he doesn't really see. They don't register. And he brings a little historical note. He said, Bizmanenu, in our times, Bizmanenu ele yachol kol adam liros plaos mishinu ha'itim. We can see wonders happening in the different things happening in our times. Hamu goyim matu mamlochos. Nations are shaking and trembling. The hashgacha pratis is present al kol prat v'prat b'ofen muflo. You can see this happening in these wondrous ways. And he says you have to protect yourself from having sanverim. You got to see that amazing things have happened, are happening. Rav Fishel Shechter mentioned, he read once that one of the early Zionists was speaking to a member of the British government about the possible idea of making a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And he said, do you realize what would have to happen for that to happen? He says the British Empire would have to fall. The Austro-Hungarian Empire would have to fall. The Ottoman Empire would have to fall. Right? Ridiculous. And it all happened. That was the period he was talking about. Okay? And people kind of go along and what's for lunch? Right? That's sanverim. You know, when you're not able to see that and do it. Okay, we have to take a break for one of my favorite stories now that relates to this. We'll try to see. Reb Shaila of Karastir. Okay, there was a Rebbe in Hungary in the pre-war years. Reb Shaila of Karastir. You were in Karastir, Alex? Never been to. Oh, you got to get it. It's a very little town. It's one of these places where the welcome to Karastir sound and thank you for visiting Karastir sign nearly bump into each other. It's just this really little town. And Reb Shaila was famous for his Ruach HaKodesh, but especially for the care that he gave and took care of so many Jews who needed in an exceptional way. Along with that, he had this ability of seeing things far, far away from Karastir. Rav Shraga Feivel Mendelovich, who was such a founder of the whole world of Torah in America and also in Israel as well in many ways, he said before he left Hungary to America, he met with Rav Shaila, who told him things that were going to happen in his life, and he said all of those things happened. So the story was about a Jew from Hungary who moved to New York in the early part of the century, and he was scraping away to try to make a living. He opened a laundry of some type, and he had it closed on Shabbos, and he was making a living. However, after a bit of time, there was a very large group of people who seemed to have relatives in the mafia as well that opened up a much bigger, much fancier laundry, very close to his, and he was losing business. That wasn't enough for them though. He started to get these notes and messages that it really would be worth his while, and in fact, good for his health, if he would just close down his laundry entirely. So a friend came from Hungary to America and was visiting him, and he was pouring out his heart. He said, what do I do? What do I do? He says, listen, I'm going back to Hungary. I'm going to go into Reb Shaila, and I'm going to ask him what you should do, because I'm going to be coming back to America, and I'll bring you his answer. So he had this trip. He went back to Hungary. He had to do some things there. He was doing business between Hungary and America. He came back. He said, Reb Shaila gave you this kameah, something written. It was closed up. He says, keep this with you. He said, you'll know when to open it. So he had this kameah. Meanwhile, the competing laundry lost patience with him, and they hired a young man from the streets, and they said, listen, you see this laundry? Here's a can of gasoline, right? Here's some matches. Late at night, you're going to go there and make it go away. The guy said, fine. They would pay him. So he goes out at 3 o'clock in the morning, and he goes to where the laundry was, and he couldn't find it. Just wasn't there. He was very embarrassed. What kind of criminal is he? He's walking around Manhattan in the middle of the night with this thing of gasoline, right? And eventually he had to ask directions. He said, isn't there a laundry store here or something? They said, yeah, you got to go right, left, right. So he goes finally, laundry. Breaks the window, pours in the gasoline, throws the match, boom, and he gets away. So the Jew gets up the next morning to go to shul. He smells smoke. There's all these things going around. He goes running to his laundry. It's fine. The man had actually set fire to the other laundry. And when he was caught by the police, he sang like a canary and said, well, these guys hired me to set fire to the other person's laundry. So that was what happened there. Eventually, the man got the news from Hungary that Reb Shaila passed away. He said, that must be what Reb Shaila meant, that I would know when I could open the kameah. So he opened it up, and it simply had written there this pasuk. It says, the people who were in the doorway of the house were struck with sanverim, right? They could not find the doorway. Okay, so again, these stories are cool, right? These stories are exciting, but I want to tell you another story that I think gives us the key to where Reb Shaila gets that ability. Again, as we said, Reb Shaila was the pillar of chesed, and he spent so much of his time and energy doing the most basic chesed, feeding people, helping them with everything they needed. So at one point, as word was getting out about the power of Reb Shaila's brachas and such, so the Munkatcher Rebbe was curious to see him. He had not met him, and he wanted to see and come. So he came to Reb Shaila's, and Reb Shaila was making a big suda. So he had a very big challah on the table, and there were all sorts of poor people around the table. So Reb Shaila made a bracha on the bread, and he made hamotzi lechem min haaretz. He immediately ripped it open. He took out from the soft part of the challah inside, and he immediately gave it to a man across the table who ate it, and then Reb Shaila went on and took a bite. The Munkatcher Rebbe, also a very big posek, was not happy with this, and he started to right? Because, right, if a person is making hamotzi, the bracha of hamotzi, to fulfill the bracha for all the people around, he has to take the first bite, right, before someone else does. So he pointed this out to Reb Shaila. Reb Shaila said, Munkatcher Rebbe, you're a big Rav and posek. All I know is it any worse than Gavil l'Torah? What is Gavil l'Torah? There's a halacha that you're supposed to feed your animals before you eat yourself. So if a person made the bracha, but suddenly realized he hadn't fed his animals, Gavil l'Torah means prepare the food for the shore, for the ox. You're allowed to say that beforehand. He said, I looked around the table and I saw this man, and he looked so terrible, I could tell he hasn't eaten for a long time. And I saw that he didn't have teeth, so he wouldn't be able to eat the crusty part of the bread. So I immediately tore it open, took out some of the soft part of the bread and gave it to him. Did I do wrong? So the Munkatcher Rebbe said, not only did he do right, but I realized the following. I didn't see that man and the state that he was in. I wasn't able to see that he was starving so badly. I certainly didn't see that he didn't have teeth. Reb Shayla saw those things. One who can see those things is able to see what's happening in Manhattan. That's where the power comes from. So, this is our world of Sanverim. These are the sons-in-law of Lot who laughed at him. Okay, now, why Sanverim out of all things? Throughout Tanakh, we do find different times that Hashem stops bad people from doing things. And there are all sorts of ways. They can drop dead. They can go mad. That happens sometime. They can be frozen, like Yeravam's arm when he was about to attack a Novi. And that's only part of the menu. There are all sorts of things. Why do this one? It's interesting. It's amusing that they were blundering around, right, seeing imaginary doors and not being able to get in. But why that one particularly? So, the roots of the evil of Sdom were arrogance. There's a pasuk in Yechezkel about Sdom. Hinei ze hoya avon Sdom achosech. Gaon savat lechem. Gaon is a lashon of ga'ava, of arrogance. Satisfied with bread. Shalvas hashket hoyala. You lived in peace and quiet. V'yad oni ve'evyon lo hichzika. And you did not support the poor and the desperate. This was Sdom. Sdom had this idea of arrogance. And therefore, in their world of arrogance, they didn't see other people. They didn't see their suffering. They were totally self-centered. Rav Wolbe says that the word for cruelty in Hebrew, achzar, is actually a compound word. Ach, which is a word in Hebrew which can emphasize totally. Zar means foreign. The only way a person can be cruel to someone else is if they feel totally foreign to them. And Sdom was a place of great cruelty. They were the opposite of the midah of chesed. That's why when it says that Lot went kedem, he went east, Rashi says he traveled away from kadmono shel olam, from the predecessor of the world, meaning Hashem. So Moshe Shapiro explained that this means the midah of chesed, the midah of loving kindness that was behind the creation of the whole world. So this was the problem in Sdom. Therefore, Hashem punishes midah keneged midah, attribute according to attribute. People who were arrogant, people who didn't see what had to be seen, and didn't see it in the right way, were not able to see that which they wanted to see. They were not able to see the door of the house that they so much wanted to break into. The sons-in-law of Lot were not able to see the imminent danger that was coming. Midah keneged midah. If you don't see others and their needs and their pain, if you don't look at the world that Hashem created as a world of chesed, in which there's a chain of chesed that you're supposed to be part of, and if you've been showered with blessings like the people of Sdom were, the purpose of that is for you to be one who shares and one who gives chesed. So here, we find an interesting sub-detail. It was one of the great Magidei Shir in the Mir Yeshiva here in Yerushalayim. His name was Rebbe Baruch Finkel, that's all. He passed away at a relatively young age. Not long ago, they brought out different Perushim, he said, on Chumash, on Shabbosas. So he said, when we look at this pasuk about the sons-in-law, we find an interesting discrepancy. A few people point out this discrepancy. It says, Vayetze Lot vayidaber el chatanav lokchei benotav. He went out and he spoke to his sons-in-law, lokchei benotav, who took his daughters. But then when it talks about who laughed at him, it said, Vayihi k'mitzachek beinei chatanav. He was like a joker in the eyes of his chatanim. What is the difference between chatanav lokchei benotav and what's plain chatanav? So he explained. Chatanav lokchei benotav were ones who were engaged to his daughters, but were not yet married to them. He had single daughters, as we see from the continuation of the story. Chatanav are the ones who actually were married to his daughters already, fully. Said Rebbe Baruch the following. He said, Chatanav lokchei benotav, they didn't laugh at him, those sons-in-law, right? Because he said, listen, I got a free pass here. You can come with me and get out of this before all the fire and brimstone comes down. They didn't laugh at him. But Chatanav, the ones who had already married his daughters, said Rebbe Baruch, they knew Lot already. They'd been in his house. Why'd they laugh? They said, you're no better than us. Right? Come on. What do you mean? Oh, the angels told me that I get a free pass and everyone who comes with me. You? Why you? That makes no sense. So again, it's an aspect of sanverim, of not being able to see, which cost them their lives. But what type of not being able to see? What they didn't see was that Lot, as bad as his behavior was, like the other people in Sodom, had something hiding inside of him. And this is something that's very true about people, that things hide inside. At the beginning of the whole Sodom story, we find HaKadosh Baruch Hu saying something very unusual. He says, Erdono ve'er'eh hakatzakata. I'm going to go down and see if what's happening in Sodom is like all of the screaming that people are screaming about. Obviously, a very difficult pasuk. Hashem has to go down, Hashem has to see, has to go on an investigative venture. It doesn't make sense. So the Shem Shmuel explains the following way. Hashem says, I'm going to send Kedusha into Sodom. And I'm going to see if the people of Sodom, if that awakens anything in them. The presence of Kedusha, sending Malachim into Sodom. Hashem's Shlichim. A Malach is translated also as a messenger, as a Shliach. They came to Sodom, zip, nothing. What did they want to do? Kill them, and worse. Lot, however, did wake up. Suddenly Lot, who had gone to Sodom and was involved in the things in Sodom, suddenly, he brings them home, right? He risks his life to protect them. That was because, said the Shem Shmuel, Lot had David HaMelech inside of him. Lot had that Kedusha which is inside that did wake up at the time. It didn't last, right? It's something that ignited and went out. When something like that ignites, you have to know how to be able to take it. And that's why, again, he wasn't privileged to look back at what was happening there. He wasn't that different from the people of Sodom, but that was enough for him to be taken out. So the laughter of his sons-in-law was another aspect of arrogance, of looking at a person and just not being able to believe that there's something special in them. Lot was saying, there's something special about me and my family that these malachim revealed. We can go. And they said, nothing special about you, man. Right? Forget it. We know you. This teaches us a very important principle. That you should never treat a person cheaply and feel that you know everything about the person and that that person can have no hidden treasure inside. If that was true with Lot, it's certainly true with every single Jew. And that's where we have to come to some stories about this. So there's a beautiful story that happened in Berlin. The Sridei Eish, Rebbe Chil Yaakov Weinberg, was a great Talmud of Slobodka, who later became the Rosh Yeshiva of the Rabbinical Seminary in Berlin. And he told the following story. So just after the First World War, he went to daven on Yom Kippur in one of the big shuls in Berlin. Now, when it came time for Yizkor, suddenly, one of the ministers of the German government, named Walter Rettenau, right? He eventually became the foreign minister and was actually assassinated. So he came to shul. His father, Emil Rettenauer, had been a very big industrialist. He founded AEG, which still exists, and he was an assimilated Jew. The son continued in this assimilated path, but on that Yom Kippur, after his father died, he decided, I'm going to say Yizkor. So how did he come to shul? In a motorcade. He came in his fancy government car. He had a police escort. He parked right in front of the shul. And he came in for a few minutes for Yizkor, and he got back in his car. So the Sridei Eish says there were some Jews in the shul from Eastern Europe. Right? This was a time after World War I. Many Jews from Eastern Europe were moving from place to place. Many of them ended up in Germany. The Germans called them the Ostjuden, the Eastern Jews. And they started to laugh. They laughed a scornful laugh, what's called lag. They said, what does this guy think? He's honoring his father, driving on Yom Kippur, to come for Yizkor in the middle of Yom Kippur and to drive off? So Rav Weinberg, the Srida Eish, chastised them. He said, no, you should not treat this Jew cheaply. He says, there's something there. He honors his parents. It's a deep thing that Jews have. Something deep inside of him woke up. And as long as that has not extinguished entirely, it could be that that will develop into something deeper. And he gave an interesting example. He said that Yaakov Avinu was traveling and he passed by the place of the Beis HaMikdash. He missed it. And he had reached Haran, and he said, wait a second. Maybe I passed by the place where my forefathers davened and I didn't daven there. So Weinberg asks, we're talking about the Beis HaMikdash, right? Not congregation, b'nai, whatever, right? That's how you describe the Har HaBayis, the place where my grandfather davened, right? He says, that's showing you that that's something powerful, and not to break off that chain. So the student of Rav Weinberg who brought this story told the following follow-up. He said he was giving a shiur here in Israel, in the town of Modi'in, and he happened to mention that story. One person in the audience got up and said, you're talking about Rittenauer? I'm a descendant of his. What happened? So that Walter, who was the government minister in Germany, he never married. His sister did marry and had a son. That son, for whatever reason, was in Hamburg and went into a shul, and he loved the singing. And he kept going back to shul. And he became religious and he moved to Israel. And this was a descendant of his. So what Rav Weinberg said was true. You have to be very careful before laughing at another Jew. You may have sanverim. You may be blinded. You may not be seeing, and that comes from arrogance. That comes from gaiva. That's what the lesson is of that particular thing, that chain. Arrogance, sanverim, not being able to see, and then laughing at people. Rav Moshe Feinstein, that's how said, when he started to find that people were asking him for brachas, he was very uncomfortable. Rav Moshe Feinstein was a great posek in America. He handled all the difficult halachic questions that came up, and people started coming to him asking for brachas. He said he felt uncomfortable. That's not my field. Right? There are other specialists in those things, to go to. But then he remembered what Chazal said. Chazal said, "Al tieh birkas hediot kala be'inecha." Let not the bracha of a simple person be light in your eyes. He said, why? Okay, again, the scenario. You're walking down the street and some guy, right, wanders over and says, I'd like to give you a blessing. It's like, who are you? Right? It's like, right, you're giving blessings. He says, don't do that. Why? He says, the way I view it is that a blessing is a way in which a person is trying to transfer his merits over to you to help you. Sometimes a person's in a tzara, he's in a difficult situation. That's like a lock. There's a key to that lock. Now, if we look at how a key works, a key has all sorts of ridges and bumps. And the lock cannot be opened until the key has every single ridge and bump. It could be that this person who's giving you this blessing has that one particular merit that's the last bump on your key that's going to make the lock turn and set you free. He said, at least I can do that also. And that was why he felt more comfortable about giving the brachas. Don't scorn that person. You have no idea what's inside of them or who's there. Today was the Yahrzheit of Rabbi Avram Elimelech of Karlin. He was one of the sons of Rabbi Yisrael, the Yanuka of Karlin, and he visited Eretz Yisrael multiple times. His last trip was a very dramatic one because he came to really storm the gates of heaven to daven because World War II was oncoming. And he insisted on going back to be with his community, even though it was clear what was going to happen. And people tried to stop him, and yet he insisted on going back. During one of his trips in Eretz Yisrael, so he got to see kibbutzim. Kibbutzim were starting up. Now, these kibbutzim were not usually religious strongholds, often the opposite. He said, but I see here something very useful to learn. Number one is that they do things together. They do things together. And they can accomplish a lot. He said, even the greatest person cannot accomplish things alone. Number two, they are willing to work day and night for something that they won't directly benefit from, just simply because it's one of those things. He says you have to pay attention to what you can see inside there that's good. Two stories to finish on the idea of treating every Jew as that treasure chest because of what's in there. The Beis HaLevi, Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, the root of the famous Soloveitchik dynasty, was once traveling someplace in Europe and it was freezing cold. He had to stop. They came to an inn and knocked on the door. The innkeeper didn't answer at first. Eventually he came. It was at night. He says, what do you want? Please, can we stay here for the night? He said, no vacancies, no rooms. All the rooms are taken. I got guests coming. Please, can't we come in someplace? It's freezing. He said, all right, come to the hallway. So the Beis HaLevi came in. He sat on the floor in the hallway. He lit a little candle and he took out his sefer and he started to learn. The man said, put out the candle, you're disturbing us. So he sat in the dark and he tried to think Torah thoughts and learn by heart. A bit later on, there was a great amount of noise. There was a Hasidic Rebbe, Reb Aaron of Koidenov. He was the person who had reserved the rooms in the inn. He came and the innkeeper came out with pomp and circumstance. Welcome, Rebbe, welcome, Rebbe. As he walked in, he noticed somebody sitting on the floor. He goes, Rabbi Yoshe Ber, the Rav of Brisk. And the innkeeper goes, uh-oh. Right? the Rav of Brisk. So the innkeeper starts coming, I'm sorry. I had no idea who you were. So he said, that's not a good answer. I had no idea who you were? Is there anybody who should be treated like that? He said, I do forgive you on the following condition. You will come and live with me for 2 weeks. And he came to his house and he saw how Rabbi Yoshe Ber treated all types of Jews equally. The ignorant and the wise, the rich and the poor, the sane and the insane, all the different ones which was there. And he taught him that lesson. Similarly, perhaps Reb Zusha of Anipoli had a famous story. We know that the brothers, Reb Elimelech and Reb Zusha, in the beginning parts of their teaching, they traveled incognito. They went around as two tramps traveling from town to town, trying to bring Torah and elevation to Jews in all sorts of ways. And then later on, they became more well-known as Rebbes. So at one point, Reb Zusha, after he was already known as a Rebbe, came to one of the towns he'd been in previously. And they started to announce, the tzaddik is here, the Rebbe is here, we're going to have a special Suda. And they laid out a very beautiful Suda, and they set up a head table, and they put a steaming plate of food in front of Reb Zusha. And he took the food and he poured it on his clothes. He was wearing a very nice, what's called a kapota, this Rebbe thing. He dumped it on there and he said, Es kapota, es, eat kapota, you should eat. And they're looking at him like, what are you doing? He says, well, listen, I was here in this town before and you never made a meal like this for me before. I'm the same me, I'm just wearing different clothes, so I figure the meal must be for the clothes. Right? This was what he was trying to teach them. Don't look at the outside, look at the inside. A person of humility, a person of Yirah Shamayim, the word Yirah has the same letters as Re'iyah, as seeing, will be able to see what's inside a person, will be able to see those things that they need to save themselves, to help others, and will not be arrogant and cheapen another person they see in front of them. So that when that person says something, they won't scoff at them or laugh at them. They realize, you know what, maybe there's more here than what we see. This is what we learn from the sons-in-law of Lot and their Makkah of Sanverim and the lessons about every single Jew. Have a wonderful Shabbos, a wonderful week. You're welcome.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
You mentioned that in Stone there was one of the things where they didn't want to share their wealth with guests.
Yeah.
So how did Lot get to live there? Because he was initially also a guest, I assume.
Oh, so that was apparently because Lot brought a lot of money to the table. Okay, Lot was extremely rich. Yeah, so like if an immigrant wants to come to a country that has problems with immigrants, if he's a billionaire, suddenly the visas come through much quicker.
Also another question.
Yeah.
You mentioned there were sort of two types of sons-in-laws, like the ones that were already married and the ones that were not married yet.
Yeah.
The ones that didn't love, why didn't they join in? Like, I mean, if they did.
Oh, so they didn't laugh, but they still had the San Verim, it seems. They still, yeah.